You know, I don't just talk about video game design all day. You could be forgiven for not thinking that, given the videos I upload. But my obsession, if I may share it with you, is really just utilitarian. I like talking about build systems, the choices the player is given in a game to adjust their playstyle to their liking, mostly because I think that is an under-discussed topic. I have lots of other interests which I simply don't think are under-discussed, and that's why I'm here making videos about builds in games most of the time, instead of about that stuff. Games would be more fun if we all understood the ways that making builds can be fun better, and I don't even think it's that complicated as much as it's just not something that gets the focus that it might benefit from. And now for the transition of a lifetime. You know what other topic is not so much complicated as rendered obscure by how people often present it? I'm going to begin this video by talking about how I'm going to recommend making a latte, and it's going to be quite different than how people have recommended making a latte before on the internet, for the most part. Even though there are timestamps in the description to the various parts of this long video where you can hear me talk about recommendations for delicious tea, kombucha, hot chocolate, cocktails, I would like to ask you to do me a favor and listen through this first bit before you use those timestamps to skip to the part that you're more interested in, because I would like to use this part as an example to explain the philosophy behind these recommendations. It'll be pretty quick, I think it'll make sense. Here, let me show you. This is the process I'm going to recommend, and don't worry, you don't have to follow it all. I'll play back through it again after this, to make a latte. And it's going to be quite different to how you've seen lattes made before. I'd like you to think back to other times you've seen a latte made, or just that you've seen a latte. There's kind of two ways that come to mind for me. The first one is the sexy YouTube video B-roll of an unctuous shot of espresso, beautiful, delicious crema oozing out of the espresso machine. Super close up too, and then milk is foamed beautifully, poured on top as glorious latte art, and it fills right up to the top of the glass. This is quite different to that, again, as you're seeing this footage. And then the other way would be you've seen someone get a latte in a drive-thru, like something like that. And you probably didn't see it made at all. You possibly weren't there even. And it's in a cup. You're not even seeing the latte that much. It may have latte art. You might be going to a nice cafe. You're out somewhere. But you may or may not have even seen it made, let alone had that super close-up. Now, both those cases have something in common. They're both more expensive than this method. They both use an espresso machine, though in the cafe case, it's not one that you own. And they're extracting the coffee under a lot of pressure, and they're using a steam wand, and there's a lot of commonalities. So the thing about this method is that I feel those two ways of getting coffee, the delicious shot of espresso with foamed milk on your home espresso machine and getting it from a cafe or a chain, those two ways are kind of extremes, right? And I feel like a lot of people are not extreme. It makes more sense to recommend something in the middle, to me. I mean, it doesn't not make sense to see those things. It's good that you've seen those things for this example. But don't you think it'd be nice to have another data point on there? And I feel like this is true of a lot of things. People who get interested in a topic tend to go, all into it. And so the only perspectives on a subject you see are the people that don't care about it at all, and the people who go way further than you're interested in going, even though there is a moderate position that would possibly highly benefit you. You don't get the people that have the recommendations that maybe are more everyday, that you just do in your daily life, and you don't have $1,000 to spend on an espresso setup, and you're also interested in coffee, or it's cheaper to make it this way than to buy it anywhere you'd go out, and you want something in between. And so that's what this video is meant to be for. It's not meant to be me saying, yeah, I think this is the best way to do it. It is the best way to do it for me that I've thought of, but really that's just because I wanted something in the middle. And all I'm trying to do here is provide another middle data point. Does that make sense? And so what I would request is not that you worry about, this is the right way to do it. I think it's wrong to do it any other way. Please don't think of it like that. A lot of the ways I'm making drinks in this video are actually specifically modified from how I do them, just because I think it makes a better example, and I'll explain that as we go along. There's lots of brands in this video, none of which I am sponsored by. I'm just showing you them because I think they're very good. I've used them for months or years, and I've almost always compared to another option, so I'm confident that this is like a meaningfully better choice than just picking some other thing. The purpose of this really is just that you could try doing these methods and then comparing to some other less or more effort or money method. And then you have two options and you can see. And once you have that choice, you can make a decision. You can pick something that suits you. You might be seeing that latte and thinking, yeah, man, I think the latte art is beautiful. I want to pour or purchase latte art. That's fine. I mean, you could do it with this method, by the way. I'll explain why I'm not making latte art with this method. But that's it. Thank you for listening to my request to hear out my philosophy for this video. I will now go through that latte method again. We're going to start with coffee. But you could now, if you'd like, use the timestamps in the description of this video to skip to a type of drink that you want to hear more about. Skip around, come back to something, whatever you'd prefer. Although I am quite confident in this latte bit, so let's get in. So the latte. If you want to be technical about it, the drink I am referring to is a drink made of basically 6 ounces of milk and a shot of espresso. That's going to be defined for this video as about an ounce of very concentrated coffee. Now, in the examples from before, you had your chain coffee and your espresso machine latte. The shot of espresso was espresso in the technical sense that it was extracted with pressure by an espresso machine, a lot of pressure, 9 bars or whatever of pressure. But you don't need to extract coffee compounds from coffee beans with 9 bars of pressure to make coffee that is culinarily functional as that ingredient in the latte. You follow me? It won't taste the same, but you can make a drink that tastes good and has more or less the flavor like balance. It is the same dish as a latte, if you want to think of it that way, without using an espresso machine, which when I say it that way, it's like, well, of course you can. You just need very strong coffee. So this method is basically about deciding how you want to get that very strong coffee element, and then if you want the foamed milk, how are you going to get that element? And then just tweaking it to your taste. It doesn't have to be 6 ounces of milk. Some people prefer half water or just less milk, although there are drinks that are named that. A cappuccino, maybe 4 ounces of milk. A cortado, maybe 2 ounces of milk. However you want to slice it, that type of drink. That's what we're making here. So the problems to solve are principally how to get something that will culinarily function as a shot of espresso while avoiding an espresso machine, because that, even a decent espresso machine, is quite expensive. So let's have a look, this time breaking down each individual step. I'm going to weigh about 20 grams of coffee beans. Now throughout this video, we're going to talk about measurements quite a bit, but I want you to keep in mind that in many cases you can eyeball these things. The way I'm measuring the coffee beans here, like I'm doing it on the lid of my grinder because that's convenient for me. And so yeah, with this spread out, way of measuring coffee beans, it is a bit difficult to eyeball what is the right amount. But if you just did it in a small cup, it would be pretty easy to put about the same amount of coffee in every time. And this will taste good even if you don't put in the exact same amount every time. Like, that's perfectly fine. That being said, I think that you can eyeball better or effectively because you have once measured. So I would still recommend buying a $10 like cheap gram scale and a thermometer, which we'll come back to later. Not because you should necessarily use them every time. Personally, I think I've been convinced that people can be quite consistent just eyeballing things, but again, provided that they know what amount that is, that they, and that you use the same vessel every time. So a big recommendation here is I'm using the same mug, that same black mug that we'll talk about more later, every single time I make this, which means I don't really need to measure. I measured once ever, and now I'm not doing it again. Does that make sense? We'll continue. So 20-ish grams of coffee beans. You're going to see me spray them with a little bottle of water there. That quick, very small mist of water just makes them not static up in the grinder. It just makes it less messy, and it's so easy to do. Again, you have it and you sit there and psh, it's done. This grinder has an auto off, so I'll just dump them in. I'm putting them in while the grinder is running, and you can see the camera rumbling, because that causes them to grind more evenly. If it's full of coffee, then the grinder will start. It'll be a little slower at first. Those beans will grind differently. The other thing is that I'm of course using it as a single dose grinder. If you just have it full of coffee, depending on the grinder, it can be quite difficult to get out any even remotely specific amount of coffee. This is just much easier. Again, even if you were to eyeball, fill a vessel with the same amount of coffee every time and dump it in, it's just much easier. You dump in the amount you want and then that's it. This grinder even has an auto off function. This is the Wilfa Uniform. This is the US model from Lardera coffee roasters. Again, none of these people are sponsored, by the way. It's good. I've compared to the Baratza Encore. That's another grinder I might recommend. These are beginner to mid-range, but very good quality coffee grinders that will serve you perfectly well. There's really no need to get another one for a very long time. But I am going to recommend getting one of these. We'll talk about that a little more later when we get to filter coffee and we talk about coffee quality. But here, just know that's what that is. And I do think it's fantastic. One nice little thing here, it's got an auto off function. Anyway, 20-ish grams of coffee, it's grinding away. And then we can start talking about the AeroPress. You can see it's set up there in the background. I'm also using a deliberately terrible pouring kettle, and that's relevant here because the AeroPress brewing method I'm going to show you really permits like an atrocious pouring kettle. And you don't need a long gooseneck kettle that lets you do a very controlled pour. That can matter for some types of coffee brewing, but it doesn't really matter here, and I'll demonstrate why. I will also talk more about the gooseneck pouring kettle thing when we get to black coffee or filter coffee quality, because I think it's worth explaining why that's common, but you definitely don't need that at all. You can use whatever random kettle or no kettle, boil water on the stove, and that's it. By the way, boiling water. You don't got to worry about the temperature. Let's actually step aside for a sec to break down the AeroPress quickly. This is a BPA-free plastic brewer that is pretty inexpensive, basically indestructible, and rather versatile. But the way I'm going to recommend using it is as a way to remove a very small amount of liquid from a lot of coffee grounds. With an espresso machine, you can do that using pressure, basically. But it can be a little bit of a pain otherwise, and so I'm going to recommend doing it this way. You could get concentrated coffee a few other ways, we'll talk about that later, but I think this is a good one. And it's just easy and very cheap, and because it's plastic, benefit number one, you don't need to preheat it to achieve very high temperature. This is kind of more important if you're doing lighter roasted coffee, which you might not be, but it's just one less thing to worry about. And what's the problem with that? It's basically indestructible too. I throw this at the wall, I'm more worried about the wall. Two main pieces. Here you can see there's a brew chamber body. If you're going to eyeball, which we talked about earlier, having these little numbers here, like these are not very precise, but they are a benchmark of some kind. So you could absolutely use them to eyeball if you wanted to go down that route. Just something to note. So this would be the bottom that sits on your mug or whatever, something sturdy, by the way. I'm not going to recommend pushing hard, but you do still have to push. And then you've got the plunger, the piston. So this would normally go in the top, and you'd push it down and, get your coffee out. The way I'm using it in the video, you'll notice, was inverted. So instead of using it like this and then you push down, I'm going to take the plunger upside down, stick the chamber in it upside down, push it in a little bit, and then I've got a little base and it can stand like this. Might be a bit crooked, that's a bit awkward, but it's fine. And the great thing about this is that now you have a closed chamber. Yes, it looks oily inside. That's the oil from the coffee that I made with it 2 hours ago to film the footage for this video. So give me a break here. And that means you have a closed area. So you can pour as messy as you like, as long as it's about the right amount of water, and it's going to be fine. So that's one benefit here. Once we're done, combining the ingredients, you'll see that you can simply flip it over and plunge it as normal to get the coffee out. So here you'll see again, I'm loading up the coffee grounds from before, nice and de-statified. They're not staticky because of that water spray from before. It's a little awkward. The AeroPress does ship with a little funnel cone. So if you're worried about getting the coffee in, they do actually include a piece that makes it easy to do that. I just don't find it necessary. Here's the water. I'm pouring 60 grams of water. So 20 grams of coffee, 60 grams of water, or thereabout. You can definitely do more water. I would care a lot more about getting it done than getting it exactly right. It's better to combine all the coffee and all the water with a known amount of time, contact time, rather than pouring the exact perfect amount of water in, especially with a bad pouring kettle. There you saw I then stirred it about 20 times. The AeroPress comes with a convex spoon, which is quite nice for this, but you could just use whatever spoon. It's just easy, and I've got that nice wooden dock there to store the spoon. So I think that's easy. And you can go clean it while this brew is happening. Which you definitely should do. You can see it'll need a wipe. You can't just rinse them off because of that coffee oil, and you're getting a lot of that because it's a lot of coffee grounds in a little bit of water. Anyway, stir it, make sure all the coffee grounds are wet. There will be pockets because there's such a small space and a lot of coffee and not that much water. Make sure you stir it. Again, the whatever pouring kettle off to the side. I have a much better pouring kettle, and I'm deliberately using this bad one, I've said. But I want you to be reassured that you can. The filter cap. So that'll get put on. Normally with 2 papers is what I'd recommend. The AeroPress papers are great because they are very small. They don't taste bad enough because there's not enough paper for it to be meaningful to rinse them. That's an extra step you can eliminate. And they're just cheap. It's not that much paper. You're not wasting that much paper, and you get a lot of them really easily. If we were trying to mimic espresso exactly, I suppose it would make more sense to use a metal filter, and you well could. I don't like how that tastes as much with the AeroPress, and one reason is possibly because there's little gaps in the sides. This might be a little difficult to show you. Now you can sort of see, so see with a paper in, you can see that there's these little gaps. You see my finger in there? Where a little bit of sediment will go through the sides. Now from a design perspective, I guess this is so it doesn't get stuck. There's a way for the pressure to release what very little pressure is building up in here, I guess. And it does give AeroPress coffee a very medium or sort of balanced character. You get a little bit of the body of the coffee as if it was metal filtered, but also a good amount of filtration from the paper. That's an interesting balance. Anyway, I generally prefer it with paper. You can use a metal filter. This is the Disc Fine. I don't remember the brand, but it should be easy to find. Able Brewing, the Able Brewing Disc Fine. This is excellent. It's quite common for people to actually stack this with a couple other AeroPress papers to block that gap for more clarity. I don't do that, but that's a thing people do. Anyway, it's great. Now what you're seeing me do is I pressed let's go back a little bit. I pressed the air gap out of the AeroPress. So you're seeing that I'm carefully removing that big space. And that's just so when I flip it over, the coffee grounds are down there instead of stuck to the side. Here I need to give you a quick warning. Here's the AeroPress as it's set up there. Now I'm going to cap it. But remember that this is not a vacuum. This is not a tight seal. If you push down like this, it's in the air and this is an awkward angle, so it's easy for me to do. But I want you to keep in mind that you could easily fire coffee all over the place. You got to be careful. I don't think this is really very dangerous in practice. You just need to know to brace your hand here against the plunger. Don't just hold this part and then push down with your whole hand. Hold the plunger a little bit too to slow down your hand a little. And then everything should be fine. As long as you just do it gradually, take your time. You got to let it brew for a minute 30 seconds or so anyway. Not too long, but don't rush. It's better to have overbrewed coffee than coffee all over your face. And just gently push it down. Don't worry too much about getting the air gap totally gone. Although even if you can't see the air gap, remember that this is some space as well. There's some air space here. So when you can't see the air gap, it's gone enough, but you do still have a little leeway. So don't worry too much. Okay, we've gotten the air gap out. And here's this hot milk from before. We'll talk about the milk a little more later. Just giving it a little swirl. The intention is just to get all the coffee grounds there so that when I press, I'm getting, more coffee from them. They're down there, the water can pass over them. And that's it. You just let it settle for a minute and then give it a gentle press. The idea here is that if you push really hard, you're going to push some of the water through the weak points in the bed. That coffee will get a lot more material taken off it. Other coffee won't have as much material taken off of it, and it will taste bad. In the context of this much milk helping to cut that harshness, you won't notice in my experience. But yeah, it certainly won't taste better. And pushing harder is hard for no real benefit, so it's better to just push gently. All the way through the hiss, press the coffee. Remember, one of the reasons I'm suggesting this is so you can get all the coffee out. And that is commonly recommended against. People think you get a lot of bitter taste in there. Having tested it side by side, I don't think that's true. It's very easy to test. If you want to just stop when you hear a little hissing from the air gap getting pushed out, you can do that. but I've compared side by side, and I don't think that makes it taste worse. So you do you. We've got that milk. I forget how much I talked about this before. I just know that mug that I use every time, every morning, my partner uses every morning, you fill it up a little less than halfway and microwave it for 55 seconds. That's the right temperature. I just know that's the right temperature. We'll talk about that a little more later with the foaming, which we're actually doing right now. A little bit of simple syrup, and then I'm going to foam it. This is the Subminimal Nanofoamer. The names for all this stuff are in the description. And this is very easy to use. You just put it on the surface. It's going to blow air into the milk and coffee. And then after maybe 10-20 seconds, submerge it. And now you're smashing up those big bubbles. You should be able to see it. Big bubbles on the surface will get crushed and it'll look like a more fine, fluffy foam. You can kind of see it in the video. There aren't any big bubbles, big obvious bubbles like there were at first. Let's try to compare using the footage. Yeah, you can kind of see that there are large bubbles here, but now at the end it looks smoother, you could say. But not a huge difference. But it does make a big difference in the texture. It's fluffy on the mouth, kind of like pillowy. And there it is. Not beautiful latte art or anything, but it's as simple as that. That's not that bad, right? And there it is. The milk foaming. Having the coffee in before you foam the milk does make it foam less, it looks like to me. It's weird because coffee can help things foam up, but maybe it also makes the milk bubbles less sturdy. Maybe the milk was even better at foaming. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't make a big difference. I don't think it does. But if you foam the milk first, well, I'll show you. Here we are again, and you can see that I've foamed the milk first, and I'm going to press the coffee on top of that layer of fluffy foamed milk. It falls beautifully. I used a clear glass here so you could see what's going on. And you're going to start to see that a layer of coffee is forming just below the milk layer. The coffee is less dense than the milk, and its landing is being cushioned by that fluffy layer of foam, which is less dense than the coffee because it's full of air. The result looks really cool. It looks cool, but it's not mixed at all, which means you're going to have to mix it, which means you're probably going to destroy the foam. I feel like two things. First of all, you probably lose any extra foam you got by foaming the milk separately this way. Two, it's an extra step that I just don't think adds anything. And if I'm going to need to incorporate my syrup as well, I shoot the syrup in and then I want to blend it thoroughly, then yeah, it doesn't seem like it accomplishes much. The syrup. We're going to talk more about syrup. It's got its whole section for this video, but I do think a very small amount of sweetness really wakes up a hot latte, a cold latte. You don't really need it. If you like, you should try without it. But I've measured, and that little dollop I put in, that was about 5 grams of sugar. So it's not adding a crazy amount of sweetness to the drink. You're not changing it from being, no sugar to being a sugar bomb. It's very little sugar, but I find it's quite noticeable. You should definitely try it both ways. But again, with the 1 cup method, it's easy to do. And that's a big focus of this, right? Throughout this, I really focused on making sure everything is in 1 mug. It's really easy to clean this up. There's little bits of waiting time that if you like, you could just clean everything while you're waiting the small amount of time you have to wait. And that video I showed you was 4 minutes. I very deliberately did it in real time. You got to see it in real time during the intro bit where I explained the philosophy. That's very quick. You've got an espresso machine, it hasn't even heated up yet. You buy coffee anywhere other than your home, you're not even there yet. And this method, you're done. Your drink is out. Really, the biggest drawback is it's just not that pretty. It just looks kind of boring. And if you want to zhuzh it up a little bit, you of course could. You could get a milk jug dirty and pour latte art if you wanted. There's no reason you couldn't. I just think it's worth suggesting that you could not, and here's this benefit. So I think it's pretty nice. I think that's basically all I gotta say about the latte part. Well, you could have yourself an iced latte if you like. You could do that very simply. I have these jars you'll be seeing a lot through the video, and they have volumetric measurements on them, so I can pour 6 ounces of milk by just looking at the side of the jar, dump in some ice, and then press my espresso thing, my AeroPress espresso, over the top of the milk and ice, just like this. Because there's a lot of layering, I find the syrup doesn't settle at the bottom. You could just boop the syrup you want in if you want it and swirl it, and that's it. It's perfectly blended. No need to even dirty a spoon. Well, the AeroPress spoon, but don't serve with that. And that's really easy. So if you want nice latte, that's nice. For what it's worth, I do think it might be good to put less milk in by a little, or whatever fluid you're using to cut it. You could do water. This would still taste good. And that's because you're going to melt a little bit of the ice, of course. It does also irk me, as someone who's going to go on to talk about filter coffee for 15 minutes after this, it does irk me that the ice in that drink has chlorine in it. It's not like great quality water because it's just from my random ice machine. It's not through my water filter that I have under the sink in my kitchen because I'm crazy and I can definitely notice the difference. The drinking water here is good, but it's quite noticeably different in coffee and tea. So I installed a water filter, but my ice doesn't have that. In a latte, do you notice? I don't. The filter coffee section, well, making a black cup of coffee. The plain cup of coffee from the intro. Very room temperature. As it is often recommended to be tasted at, so that's fine. In this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about figuring out if you want black coffee, which is weirdly difficult. That will be maybe half the time. And then I'm going to show you a recommended method for making a black cup of coffee. This section is going to be a lot more metatextual than the other parts of the video, because I think people have been put off black coffee mostly due to an interpretation mistake or a bad communication from people who like coffee. I'll explain what I mean. Actually, I think to do that, it's better to show you the brewing method I'm going to recommend. So we got to start with the kettle. And of course, it's right here because this is this kind of video. Here is a gooseneck kettle, the likes of which you've probably seen before. This is a very nice gooseneck kettle. In fact, it's even designed in such a way where, depending on how much you tip it, it doesn't pour at a different speed. You don't really even need technique with how you tilt it or how much you pour it. It's been engineered to pour the, at the right speed, which for what it's worth, I have found that it does. The problem that I have with that whole thing is that you've probably seen people brewing coffee where they've got a cone or like an hourglass shaped thing, a Chemex or maybe a V60 with a base on it, and they're pouring very carefully and taking care not to disturb the bed of coffee, and all those things do make the coffee taste better with that brewing method. But I think what's happened, and you tell me if you don't think this is the case, by the way, this might just be me, but I do think this has happened for a lot of people, is that people have decided that that is the only way to make good tasting coffee, and they're not willing to faff about with it that much. You know what I mean? It's just a bit too much effort for them. As if you can't make black coffee that those people would like if you didn't do that. But that is not true, that you can't make exactly that style of coffee. Does pouring that way, brewing that way make a difference? Does it make the coffee taste different? It does. But can you not produce a good tasting cup of coffee, provided you somewhat limit the style of that coffee without pouring that way? You can. Here's how I'm going to recommend doing it. Basically, the difference is that, like with the AeroPress latte method from before, I'm going to recommend using a brewing method that does not involve keeping the brewer open at the bottom, because this is going to heavily reduce the need to control the pour. You can use some crappy pouring kettle and it doesn't really matter. If you watch the latte part of the video, this is a similar beginning. I'm grinding, in this case, 15 grams of coffee, a little spray of water to prevent static. It just makes it less messy, makes a big difference if you haven't tried that. Highly recommend the little spray of water. And I'm going to use steep and release brewers. I'd actually like to show you one of those before we continue. And I have here the Hario Switch, but I'll be using the Clever Dripper in the video. And these are pretty simple. The Hario Switch is a device that lets you put in a Hario V60, just a brew cone, and you can see it's totally open at the bottom, which you'd normally use to make a pour over, the way you've seen people do many, many times. I'm certain, if this part is at all significant to you. But this allows you to simply close it. It just lets you attach a base, and then you can close it or open it when you like. This one works by using a marble to stopper the brewer at the bottom. And the clever dripper, which you're going to see in the video, it does the same thing. It just, the mechanism works when you put it on a glass, it opens up the stopper and the coffee comes out. Pretty much the same thing. The Hario Switch here has the advantage of letting you put in different size cones. You could change the size from this fairly large cone, good size for 2 people, to, oh, I really like this size 1 V60 that lets you make a really small coffee. I don't usually drink that much coffee, and so this lets you make a very small coffee. We may come back to this later when we talk about tea as well, because this is 150 milliliters. I know I'm mixing, metric and imperial in this video. We're not going to do anything about that. But anyway, steep and release brewers, these allow you to just pour however, give them a swirl, and then, it levels out. All right, back to the coffee. I'm folding the filter paper. This just makes it not get stuck to the inside of the brewer or form a seal. One advantage of the clever dripper is that it uses these kind of trapezoid shaped papers. These are very, very widely available. Basically every grocery store has them. I'm going to go to the sink and rinse it just to glue it to the side. Another benefit of the clever dripper is it's plastic. It's BPA-free plastic. Think the AeroPress. The Hario Switch there was using glass. You definitely need to preheat that. If you try to brew a light coffee, you won't get a very good temperature and it won't taste as good. At least, certainly to me. Some people would recommend a lower temperature, but it will really drop the temperature a lot. This just makes it easy. There's my ground coffee. And I wanted to try to show you the brew size a little bit more. It's very difficult to communicate grind size, but I'm just going to kind of move it around with my finger. And you can kind of see the grind size, but sort of not like granulated sugar. These methods are fairly forgiving of grind size, I mentioned in the latte part of the video, because they don't need the grind size to manipulate the resistance of the brew. You can just pour however, and that's all fine. There you can see I'm pouring a little water first. This is just so it drains faster and doesn't get stuck. It's easier to evenly distribute my coffee. You don't really need to do it, but I like to. And then I pour the rest of the water so I don't have to use a spoon to stir it in. You could kind of choose. Maybe you'd rather not have to deal with pouring twice and you don't mind washing a spoon. I just prefer doing it this way. So yeah, I'm just trying to get the coffee underwater a little bit. You can see I didn't hit all of it, but it's, reasonably wet. There's no giant island of coffee that's not wet. I'm giving it a gentle swirl. Again, this is just to level the bed at the bottom. When eventually the brewer is opened, I want the bed to be flat so that it, gets coffee off of it as the water flows past it as evenly as possible. That will just make it taste better. It's quite easy to compare this. You should definitely try brewing this way and just don't do anything to the bed. That brew will probably taste very easily identifiably worse to most people's palates. It will just taste harsh. That can help you learn the taste of misbrewed coffee or coffee brewed in error rather than that being the bad taste of the coffee or something. And then I'm going to leave it for 3-ish minutes. It can taste good if you leave it longer. 3 minutes is a good benchmark. And then I'll give it another gentle swirl again and it'll drain away and that's it. And that is how I made this cup of coffee. So while this finishes up, we're just going to let it run and we're going to taste it a little bit and see how it is. This coffee, if you want to skip this tasting section, you can, by the way, but I'm not tasting every drink in this video because I don't think there's that much to say for a lot of them. Like a latte, I don't know what you want me to tell you. It's an interesting, milky, desserty without being too sweet. It's good. It's a latte. The black coffee thing, there's a big topic here for most of the rest of this section about figuring out if you like black coffee, which can be kind of hard. Definitely not something I thought I liked until I tried it. I'll tell you what I mean. But let's, that'll finish up and I'll try this. This is a monsooned coffee. I can't believe that's a real thing, by the way. I guess the people making the coffee leave it out in monsoon rain for 3 to 4 months, by the way. What? And that reduces the pH of the coffee quite a bit. This is a somewhat roasty coffee, and it has retained a little bit of its fruitiness in the way they've processed it. But because of that monsooning, I guess, it was monsooned. Anyway, the acidity has been reduced. I like some acidity, especially in my roasty coffee. Generally, if a coffee is less roasted, you get more acid and fruit. If it's more roasted, you get more chocolate, roast, nuts, you know. But I really like coffees that have both, which some roasters kind of target, and I go to roasters that have that kind of coffee. I really like that. But this was interesting. It's weird because if you've had a lot of coffee that has prominent acid and is of a kind of medium roast, I found this quite disorienting when I first sipped it. The sensation is that it tastes basic. Like it tastes like it's a base rather than an acid. It's probably pH neutral-ish or a little acidic, but it tastes of base. I don't know how else to describe that. Almost like you put baking soda in it or something, because the monsooning, I guess, has neutralized that acid, which is strange. I guess it evokes chocolate a little more to me, the way that dark chocolate has that rainforesty kind of fruity quality, but isn't usually acidic to my palate anyway. It tastes more like that. I actually often don't think coffee tastes that chocolatey, even though you almost always see that as a tasting note on even medium roasted coffees. But this has something weird, different. If you can get a monsooned coffee and you already know that you like black coffee, you should totally try it. It's really interesting. I don't know what to say about it besides that. Yeah, it's really good. It cools really well. I made a snarky comment about like it's obviously cold because I've been recording here for like hours so far, but it cools deliciously. I assure you, it really does. Continuing on with the note about enjoying black coffee, I want to bring your attention to the way I would recommend finding that out if you want to. I don't think you can go to a coffee shop and buy black coffee and know if you like black coffee, which is the basically core problem of this entire section for me. There are several reasons. One reason is that it's probably not going to be brewed for you. It's probably on a hot plate in a big carafe. And that adds some very you'll know it if you start drinking coffee like that and then try coffee the way I'm going to recommend. You'll know this flavor. It's like a caramelized in a bad way, kind of chemically taste. And I have read before that that is not very healthy either. Obviously, for the business, it's quite advantageous, but it isn't tasty, in my opinion. If you enjoy that coffee, two things may be true. I suppose others, but two possibilities. One is that you might not taste coffee or things as strongly as I do, which is no bad thing. People are just different. And two might be that you will like other coffee even more than that. I suppose a soft third is nostalgia. Definitely something that makes me enjoy some flavors of things we'll talk about later, tea. There's nothing bad about that. Again, this video isn't here to say you should impose on yourself the forbidden knowledge, looking at the shadows cast on the cave, that coffee can be delicious when it's black, but it usually isn't. Do you actually benefit from learning that? We're not going to talk about that in this video. I do kind of want to, but we're not going to. Instead, my concern is that if they do make you a coffee manually, you don't know if it was made in error if you don't have something to compare to. Coffee is available as filter coffee, made without error, so infrequently, at least in America, that I don't know how you would find out if you liked that flavor. The only thing I'll say that could get you kind of close, when I go to a cafe that I suspect probably will make good coffee, but they almost never have a filter coffee on the menu because it takes too long to make, I order an Americano. They make basically my espresso shot AeroPress thing, but with an espresso machine. They pull a shot of espresso. But you could make that AeroPress thing and then dilute it with just water, like warm water, to make something that is the strength, in terms of concentration of a filter coffee. You could do that, and I like that, but I do think that Americano style coffee has a quite different flavor profile to a normal filter coffee where you make it. I showed you how to do that. So I am going to recommend one way that I think is as kind of as good as I can think of as a way to test that out, and it is Cometeer. These are coffee capsules, like you might be familiar with K-cups or whatever. These are the size of a K-cup. They're made of aluminum. They're recyclable. If you get these, recycle them. The top and the capsule are aluminum. These are nitrogen frozen, very strong filter coffee that they brew with some method they won't tell us. And while I do think that Cometeer has kind of a flavor profile, they are brewing in some kind of weird way, I'm rather confident. And I do think it gives the coffees a commonality. I would say it brings out their sweetness, I guess. They all have that natural sweetness of coffee more than any other way of brewing coffee I've had. But I don't know. I'm not a professional coffee taster here. This is just it's a thought. But for the most part, I feel like this is a pretty good way to try what filter coffee you brew yourself tastes like. The best part, in my opinion, is that it's mirrored because my camera's mirrored, is Doux de French, a coffee roasted by George Howell Coffee Roasters, which not only do I live physically near the location of, like I live near that coffee roaster, you can buy Doux de French from George Howell on their website. So if you buy this coffee from Cometeer and then you go buy the beans for that coffee from George Howell, you can make just this as an Americano thing and as a normal filter coffee and with a Cometeer capsule. Now this you would just melt and dilute like an Americano, but they're brewing it in a way that is, it's concentrated somehow. So I do think this is a different flavor profile than an Americano style coffee. Again, I said before, it's maybe sort of its own thing, but not so much that you can't use it as an example, a data point. Anyway, you could then compare them. And I did this, and it's a great way to see, from a technique perspective, there is no error in the way this coffee was extracted, I'm quite assured. And so if you like this and then you make your own and it tastes more or less the same, you can feel like, okay, sanity check complete. I either like that or I don't. I know that seemed like a very convoluted road to get where we ended up. I do actually have one more closing thought about this. And it has to do with that thing from before with the percolation brewing. I've been avoiding saying percolation brewing. Immersion brewing, where you keep all the coffee and all the water hanging out together, kind of with these steep and release brewers or a French press or the AeroPress inverted method I showed you, and then you can, get your coffee out somehow. Versus percolation, where it's open all the time and you need to control your pour. You're going to punch a hole through it and you need to be careful about how the water is being delivered and grind size and stuff. You may wonder, if you think about it a little bit, why have I seen percolation brewing so often? Like in media, maybe it's because it looks sexy or it's shown in a movie to say something about a character. Like they are into coffee and they make coffee every morning, or they're a massive hipster who likes to do things in a really analog way, which, by the way, maybe being a hipster, I don't know. But doing things in an analog way is fine. I bet a lot of people like making a pour over that way because it's a manual physical process, a routine that gets their brain going doing something familiar in the morning. I don't care about that, but yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? But no, the reason that percolation is so common, well, in coffee brewers, manual coffee brewers, automatic coffee brewers, I mean, coffee machines, is that it lets you make a lot of coffee with a small basket. Because not all the water has to hang out in here, you can make a lot of coffee in the bottom with a small top. You just need to be able to fit the coffee grounds and some of the water. And then you can pour all the water gradually and make a much larger volume than if it were an immersion brewer. You see what I mean? If it were an immersion brewer, you would need twice the volume of the max capacity of the machine, so you can fit all the brewed coffee and all the water that is brewing into coffee above it. Whereas if it's percolation, the top part can be significantly smaller. And think about these under kitchen cabinets. Like they're trying to make them smaller. It's understandable why. And so that is why you often see that brew method. Nobody's told me that's true for sure from that industry, but it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And yet that's bad in the sense that it's much harder to brew percolation coffee without it tasting really harsh, which is why even very good coffee brewers, like my folks, my parents, have a very nice automatic coffee brewer that is nevertheless percolation, and it tastes kind of mediocre. Like for the amount of money, you would think, can't you just, do it good or whatever? And if it was exactly the same, but you just made it an immersion brewer and then let it drain down, it would taste good. As a matter of fact, I can't show you this, but I did that. one morning while I was visiting my folks. I closed the brew chamber, used it basically as a Hario Switch, and then flipped it's got a little thing you can flip. And I found out, looking it up, that that is actually a common hack suggested by the community that uses this and many other brewers like that. Because, of course it is, because that is an easy way to get a reliable coffee. So I don't know what the takeaway for this section is. I just wanted to talk about this because it was shockingly simple, I guess, to me to realize that that is why, basically, people think black coffee doesn't taste good. The coffee brewing industry is systematically using a brewing method that is going to make it taste kind of weirdly extracted, which drives me insane. Like, that's crazy. We could some other time discuss how different brewing methods, especially percolation brewing methods where you pour with a controlled pour, can make delicious coffee. You really offer you a lot of control. That was always said. I'd always heard people say it offers you a lot of control, and never with any word about what control that is. So just to very quickly cover that to whet your interest, and then I will make another video if people want, probably on my other channel. As you pouring in different stages, different amounts, or at different speeds, different amounts of water at the beginning, the middle, the end, does extract different flavors from the coffee. A brew method I really like, that was a really interesting example of this, simply involves using the Hario Switch or the Clever Dripper, letting it flow freely at the beginning, and then simply stoppering it partway through. Basically just having it be immersion at the beginning, and then, percolation at the beginning, with an immersion phase afterward. Just immersing it for like a minute at the end, after having that percolation phase at the beginning, creates an incredible depth of flavor suddenly that is very easy to compare to doing it another way. It's also a little faster. Percolation is, you could argue, a little bit faster to extract that much coffee. That was fascinating. I spent a lot of time really frustrated about that. If that frustrates you, I have more to say about that, but oh my goodness, this section has been so long. There you go. Now, we haven't covered too many drink recipes in this video so far. Well, partially because I suppose a latte is a drink recipe. But one thing you can do with the Cometeer pods is very easily make coffee beverages, very immediately. You just have these in your freezer and you go when you're ready. And I'm going to recommend one that I like very much, the caffè shakerato. This is a shaken cold coffee drink that basically it just involves using an espresso-like thing, something that will culinarily serve the function of a shot of espresso. Pour that right in. That's what the melted Cometeer pod looks like, as it were. I mean, it looks like strong black filter coffee. You get to smell the pod as a nice little bonus. I find this is kind of cheating for getting the flavor notes for the coffee if you're trying to pick out what it tastes like or smells like to you. Ooh. Anyway. So that's a nice thing to do. This one, are we doing this? It has a spiciness that I remember from this coffee. As I said, I've actually had quite a bit of this one. These pods, Cometeer's had them for a while. Lots of people in my life have gotten Cometeer. And I've also had these beans, which I brewed myself. So I'm familiar with this coffee. I'm going to add a syrup, and you can guess what the next section will be. This is an allspice syrup. This is equal parts sugar and water. I gently heated them. I'm not going to show you that. That's a little too basic. And then I put allspice in it. I just crushed some allspice berries and I heated them in the syrup. Easy for me to say. I'll put in, I'm not going to measure, but about the volume of the coffee. You can not see, but I can see that it's layering. And I'll put in some amount of water. Opinion is kind of divided about putting water in these. I've seen some people recommend the strength of a filter coffee and you shake it and then that's it. I don't know. I like a splash of water. I guess I'll do... I don't know. I'll show you. I bet that much. The other thing about eyeballing these is, I don't know. I mean, if you have the tools to fix them, you can add water. We're actually going to do a condiment section at the end of the video. You can add stuff to it to tweak it if you don't get it exactly the way you want it. Normally I'd add some saline solution, but I don't have that up here, so too bad for me. Put in a little ice. There's actually a little more water in there. And I'm going to make this here just to demonstrate that you don't need to do anything too fancy. This is not like a good setup for making drinks, but but it totally works if that's what you got. Very foamy. And because of that, I like to open pour these. You might get little pieces of ice, but you know what? I want the foam, so too bad. Oh, the foam is always so crazy. It's quite stiff too, like it'll stay for a long time. I find that's some of the fun of these. I think a lot of people don't like ice in these, but I do. It's a stiff drink, but really nice. The sweetness really opens up the concentrated coffee flavor. It's quite different from the experience of drinking like a sweetened iced coffee because it is much higher concentration than that, but lower than the concentration of drinking an espresso or an espresso-like thing. Really interesting. If you haven't tried this, I think it's great. Very refreshing form of an iced coffee, the form that I generally prefer when I want something cold and delicious that tastes like coffee. So quick, too. If you've got your coffee, you could do that AeroPress recipe from earlier in the video, and you've got this ready in like 3 minutes. You only got to clean the AeroPress stuff and your whatever you use to shake in. You could just drink it out of this. I could have just kept it in here and drank it out of. Why didn't I do that? On that note, syrups. Moving on from the coffee section of the video, something that will be used in almost all of the other parts of this are syrups. Just making a simple sweet syrup. A great way to have something to mix with in your home bar that I guess I'm making you establish. More than just for cocktails. It can be delicious to add to your latte, to some tea. Something like an infused honey could be in this category too. But just combining equal parts sugar and water isn't the only way you could do it. Again, you could take some honey or maple syrup and leave stuff in it, gently heat them, or just leave stuff in there. But there's another method I want to recommend, which is with fruit. Here is some raspberry syrup I'm going to make. I'm going to take the raspberries and weigh them because I want equal parts fruit and sugar. The idea here is that the fruit is almost entirely water. So if I were making a simple syrup with equal parts water and sugar, then I can use the fruit weight as essentially the water component. I'll then just cover it in sugar and wait for some time. It depends on the fruit. Now you could crush it up, but I'm not going to. The raspberries will be pretty quick, and if you don't crush it up, it makes it really easy to filter. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. You'll see how relatively easy this will be. I should probably tell you that it's a best practice to conserve about 1/3 of the sugar and top them with it, but this is going to be so quick that I didn't feel the need to do that. You probably should. I did blueberries like this one time, and that took weeks, and you should definitely top that with sugar so it's not exposed to open air. I'm not exactly an expert on this subject, but certainly those raspberries and that sugar would have kept fine at room temperature in the open air for, it took like 2 days. So I'm not that worried about it. Anyway, they look like that at first, and you're thinking, there's no fluid. It's not going to dissolve. But here is what it looked like after only 2 days. You're going to see that the something osmotic pressure from the sugar concentration outside the raspberries drew the moisture out of the raspberries. Again, I literally just let this sit for 2 days. You can speed it up if you roll it like this. You can see there's some sugar at the bottom in this case that won't quite dissolve. So if I roll it like this and get that sugar, soaked in raspberry juice, it will go faster. And this gentle method of speeding it up is good because I want to show you what happens if you were to stir it instead. Because the fruit is so waterlogged and saturated with sugar, it's very, very soft. The raspberries, if you were to do something like blueberries, it's probably fine. I'm going to stir it with this bar spoon, and you're going to see that little pieces of raspberry kind of fall apart. That's actually hard to see because my hand is blocking, but I'll show you inside in a second. And yeah, it does. You can see kind of at the bottom too, like there's little raspberry bits. It's kind of crushing the raspberries, even though I'm just gently stirring with a small bar spoon. And now looking inside, please show them inside. Ask Sandy who made this footage, let them see inside. You can kind of see that they have been crushed up a little bit. Anyway, you'll have to take my word for it. But yeah, just stirring it gently is beneficial when you want to filter it. Super easy. I actually used the Clever Dripper for this because I got a little metal mesh basket for the inside of it. Very helpful. We'll come to that a little later in the tea section. And now I'm just going to dump all that stuff in. That's it, because the Clever Dripper opens when you put it on a cup. This is fine. I'll drip all of it out. And you can see that with even a relatively coarse mesh, the holes are not that fine, it's going to be fine because I didn't crush the raspberries very much. And for this type of fruit, that's easy. Again, something like blueberries, I did that once and I crushed them with one, but then I didn't crush them with another. And blueberries, it took a while for the sugar to penetrate the outside and draw the moisture out. This was really quick, even without crushing them up. So again, very easy to filter, and you're seeing because there's no fine pieces, the filter doesn't really get clogged, and that's quick. I thought I was going to have to wait like a few hours or something and say, oh, I'll come back to it later. But in this shot, I basically do filter almost all of it. You can move it around with the spoon or press some of the syrup out of them, but if you do that aggressively, yeah, you're going to get more yield, but it's going to take way longer. Again, this is kind of a part of the moderate recommendations in this video. I think that people focus way too much on the yield being as high as possible. It's not good to be wasteful, but is it really worth the effort and all the water from cleaning stuff up to get every ounce of syrup out of the raspberries? I don't know. I'm sorry, but I don't think so. Earlier, I showed you these nice squeeze bottles that I got, which are really convenient. There's a number of specific products in this video. This is a more general one. Just having some squeeze bottles around opens up a lot of possibilities here. You have something to store these delicious things in, and that was so easy. But in this case, I do want to quickly highlight that you could use a recycled container too. This is a dish soap container. Do not drink soap. I'm not condoning drinking soap. I'm very clearly demonstrating, lawyers, I'm very clearly demonstrating in this video that this isn't dish soap. This is raspberry syrup that I just made in front of everyone. No one thinks I'm recommending. Please don't sue me. That's it for the syrup session, really. Super simple. Most of the syrup recommendation is just showing you ways to use it. And most of those are in the coffee section. The hot chocolate section will have some, and I'm also going to talk about it with cocktails, but those are a little later. For now, I want to talk a little bit about tea, and I always have this tea setup behind me, which we're finally going to get to talk about a little bit. Tea. The first thing I want to say about tea, the moderate recommendation about tea, is that tea is special in my mind because slightly better quality tea, like medium quality tea, produces more tea than lower quality tea. I was shocked getting into tea to realize once I started buying tea, for me in the United States, basically online, most of it from China, and a lot of it aged tea, pu'er, which we'll talk about a lot more later. I was shocked once I started drinking that tea, which I vastly prefer to the tea I was getting from the grocery store, how expensive the tea in the grocery store was relative to, like, I thought it tasted worse, but was significantly more expensive. And that's because that you can get more tea from a higher quality whole tea leaf. And it will taste better as well. For reasons I don't fully understand, having a full leaf piece is beneficial in tea. Another thought I had about tea at one point was, why not just grind the tea leaves up and then you'd have tea powder? And then I realized that's matcha. That does exist, and that's matcha powder, and also that you can do that and it will taste bad. I don't know why in matcha it usually doesn't taste bad. Maybe the way it's ground or processed, and I'm sure that's very interesting, but we just don't have time. So instead, I'm here going to spend some time showing you the setup I use when I brew tea casually. This is going to be a little involved. I'm going to show you a way to do it that doesn't involve all these little pieces using those steep and release brewers from the coffee section. But I want to show you the whole process as I would do it if I was just chilling out here at my tea bar, because I like doing this. So you'll see there that I've taken out a little Dragon Ball. I'll get one of those for you. Well, it looks like I'd already unwrapped it, but that's perfectly fine. I got this big tasting thing full of these. Now for tea, I have a bunch of recommendations in the description for where to buy the tea. For tea, many things in this video require different kinds of recommendations. And for tea, you need to have places to purchase tea like this tea. So there's a whole bunch of those in the description. But here's an unwrapped Dragon Ball, and you can see that it is a packed nut of tea. This is, and they're usually like 5 to 7 grams of tea, which is a good size, in my experience, for a 150 milliliter brewer. If you'll recall in the coffee section, I talked about how the Hario Switch, you can switch out what size the cone is, and the smallest size is 150 milliliters. That's quite nice. But of course, you can just get a teapot that is 150 milliliters. This is 150 milliliters. So this teapot that you're seeing there is the exact size for a Dragon Ball. This is convenient. When I want a little tea, I've got just the right size. I could just pop in a Dragon Ball and go. No need to measure anything, and I just fill it to the top. A little bit more about this teapot before I start using it. I think we can just let it go. But here I'm going to, the Dragon Ball's in there, and I'm going to heat up some water and open it up. But I want to talk about the teapot's features briefly. Oh, let's talk about that first. So I'm pouring hot water in, and I'm going to cap it and very quickly remove the hot water. You can actually see if you looked closely that the Dragon Ball is bubbling. Air is escaping from it. I'm trying to get the tea wet because it's tightly packed. I'm now going to pour this off and block the entire camera with my arm and let it cool down. So the heat and the evaporation and stuff will open up the Dragon Ball and make it easier to brew that tea. All I have to do is wait. It's easy to do, but again, might feel like a bit of messing around to some people. I will show you a way to avoid this. Just keep in mind that people who enjoy this type of tea brewing, well, they enjoy it partially because it is meditative. It's relaxing. You wait in between each steep. If you're going to drink the tea, it's hot. Like, it's hot, so you have to wait anyway. So I don't really mind. You absolutely can brew it faster, but certainly for Dragon Balls, it helps to open them up. So they are good for a more casual session in my experience. You saw when I poured with the teapot, this is a good time to talk about that this is a kyusu. This style of teapot usually has a handle on the side. You're meant to hold that so it's ergonomic to pour with. You can stop the top and then pour like that, which you'll see me do throughout this little session. I find these very helpful. I often deal with a lot of wrist pain, and so it was very important to me to get a kyusu. It was a little difficult to find one the size I wanted. I actually got this from a potter on Etsy, so I'll link to that shop in the description because it was really good. I really like this. This is great. It was a gift, but I mentioned the seller to the person who gave it to me, and I love this. I think it's fantastic. But 150 milliliters is the size I'd recommend. It's nice to have a smaller one for reasons that will become clear later. And of course, I do have a smaller one here as a quick example. This is half the liquid volume, 75 milliliters when it's full. And this one, you just put the top on and use it to strain out the tea like that. Very simple style. Gaiwan, they're often called. Chinese style. But anyway, whatever you like, pick one that you like, sure. But the liquid volume is important. And I would also recommend getting a glazed one. There's a whole bunch of complicated stuff I don't really want to get into here about teapots retaining the flavor of a specific type of tea brewed in them. I think we can all agree that for the middle of the road recommendation, that is too expensive. You can't buy a teapot just for one tea. If we're assuming that you're not going to buy an espresso machine to, it doesn't fit this video. The tea ball has now had some time to dry out a little bit, and it's changed temperature, so it's expanded, contracted. It will now open up much more readily when I pour water on it again, and this brew I will drink. The previous one, another purpose of it was to rinse the tea. This is pu'er. This is an aged tea, and pu'er is generally aged in open air, so I am washing off like literally dirt and dust. It's not dirty, as you saw when I showed you that Dragon Ball, but yeah, giving it a rinse isn't so bad. For what it's worth, there's also a complicated subject about whether that reduces the caffeine of the tea. Caffeine dissolves quite readily, and so if you were to throw out the initial brews of a tea, you're probably removing disproportionately large amounts of its caffeine rather than its flavor. You'll get a lot of flavorful tea, but with less caffeine. And there it is. I have these glasses. I have a whole bunch of options for glasses, but I like that one. You saw that I poured it into a peculiar vessel with a little strainer in it. And I did that to filter any little bits of leaf that came out. But you can see that the tea ball is pretty open and the leaf pieces are quite full. They're very big leaf pieces, a good sign of quality. You'd want them to be big leaf pieces. One disadvantage of getting a cake of tea and breaking off just the amount you want is that you might break some of the leaf pieces, but it's not a huge deal. You can see that this teapot does have a strainer in there, but a pretty basic one. While helpful for large leaf pieces, it definitely isn't enough if there's a little bit of dust or, inevitably there will be a few like pieces of leaf, come on. And so having a little strainer to catch them is great. Again, that might seem like a lot of faffing about to some people, but the meditative process of pouring into your fairness pitcher, it's called, and then pouring into your glass, pouring a little more into your glass, steeping again into the fairness pitcher, and gently moving around all those pieces can be relaxing. That can be meditative. That is something I like. But if you don't want it, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy tea this way. That's a whole thing. Gotta go fast. Let's get that out of there. And instead, I'm just going to use one of the brewing cones from the coffee section with a metal, basket or something in it. I'm going to use the Clever Dripper in this case. And I'll just weigh it once for the first steep to see how much water is the amount I want. Then I'll just remember where on the brewer that level of water is, so I don't need to measure it again. In this part, I'm also showing you me breaking up a tea cake instead of using a Dragon Ball. So I'll just rip off pieces of the compacted tea cake. This is another aged tea, a pu'er. And I'll put pieces of it in until it's the amount I want. Now for this example, I'm deliberately showing you very little tea in terms of gram weight. This is 3 or 3.5 grams of tea. And I'm doing that because I want to show you just how much tea that generates. That tea cake is 100 grams and it was $30, which sounds expensive, but watch how much tea 3 grams of that cake is going to make. I'll fill it up to the amount of water I want. 3 grams, about half the Dragon Ball's weight, 75 milliliters of water, about half of this teapot's weight. So that would be what I'd use the Gaiwan I showed you before for. That's how much I'd use in that. So I just measured that out. This is the rinse. I'm still rinsing it to help open up those compacted tea cake pieces. So I'm going to get rid of that steep that I just did. And I don't need the scale anymore. And then I'll just start brewing. And you can see that with it like this, it's going to be way easier. There's way few parts. I literally just pour, wait, put it on the mug. Pour, wait, put it on the mug over and over and over. And we can go like clockwork. In fact, I'm just going to speed it up so that you can see, okay, well, I guess I'm just letting it open up there. Oh, yeah, here we go. And so I'm going to pour, again, back up to that, about the mark that I remember. Now remember, it doesn't have to be exact because I'm mixing it all together. And I'm just going to speed it up and show you, pow, 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 pow. That's quite satisfying. And we'll jump ahead and I'll show you the total liquid volume that I got from doing this. But you can see that clip was maybe 3 minutes. Here it is, the final stage of brewing. I got about a liter of tea from all of that. And here's me tasting the last little bit just to make sure it still tastes like something. This is probably a good time to talk about the term fairness pitcher. Before, I was pouring my my teapot full of tea, my kyusu, into a vessel before pouring it into my glass. Why? Well, if it's just for you, I suppose it doesn't really matter. But the purpose of it, the fairness, is kind of 2 things. First of all, it's common to share this. You can imagine the gradual process of brewing with the whole setup, not the fast one I just showed you. That could be a very social process, and indeed, historically, it often was a casual, social conversation topic. You have a cup of coffee together, brew some tea this way together. And it's also fairness in the sense that this method is brewing a lot of tea in a very small volume many times. So rather than brewing maybe 1.5 grams of tea to 250 milliliters of water, and you'd steep it 3 times with good quality tea, you might call that Western style brewing, if you like. You'd instead maybe brew 5 grams of tea with only 150 milliliters of water, but steep it like 10 times. And it would, you're going to get a ton of tea out of both ways. It'll be maybe the way more with the smaller steeps because you're going to do way more of them. The point is that because you're steeping for such a short amount of time, just the time you pour has a significant amount of brewing. The first liquid out of that spout is a lot weaker than the last liquid out of that spout. So pouring it all into a vessel and then splitting it up means that somebody doesn't get the weaker part, someone gets the stronger part. You both get, an equal amount. Yeah, if you're just brewing for yourself, then from a purely flavor perspective, of course it doesn't matter pouring it into another vessel, but it helps it cool it down. And again, there's that meditative benefit if you like that. If not, do the speedy brewing I was showing you before. Anyway, the main takeaway here is just how much tea that makes. That's so much liquid. 2 of these, I would need to drink more water during this video. 2 of these from just, what was that? A 33rd of that cake, you're going to get so much tea out of that. So it might seem expensive. You get a whole cake and it's, $20, $30. $30 is also not the cheapest tea cake, but it makes so much tea. Now that is why I would probably recommend getting a kind of tasting set, which I really like. This one is from Bitterleaf. This is a lot of pu'er, and the way it works is they have, there'll be 8 or 10 different teas, and you get 2 Dragon Balls of each. Great to share as well. Send half of them, one half of the set, to a friend and brew them together. I do that with someone very near and dear to me who introduced me to this type of tea. This is great because you can try many different types of tea without having an insane amount of them, and they're a very convenient size. They're easy to just use. This one in here that's neglected, by the way, I really like that type of tea. It's Jingmai. That's one of the probably mispronounced tea mountains in China, and that region is pretty sweet, pretty minerally, pretty sweet. Kind of like the coffee section, we do need a disclaimer here, where I'm not really sure how you can determine if you like this type of tea easily without just doing exactly what I just did. But unlike the situation with coffee, you don't need a grinder to have fresh ground coffee to figure that out. I didn't really go into the grinder thing that much. I decided against it. I feel like people will do it if they think it's an appropriate investment for them. But at least with tea, right, you could buy some tea for 10, 20 bucks and just brew it. You don't really need any special equipment. You could use the jar I used to make that caffè shakerato earlier in the video and just put your water in and then strain it out with your hand or with a, don't do that, you'll burn your hand. But you get the point. It's easy to do. So you can try this much more easily for very, very little investment. And most pu'er brews with boiling water. You can use just hot water. You don't need a temperature-controlled kettle. You don't need to know what temperature the water is. It's easy. So I hope that you'll give it a try. I think that this is one of the easiest things, probably along with the syrup section. This is basically the easiest thing to try in this video. You either have loose leaf tea already, and you could brew it that way, or, you've got the sugar already, so you could do the syrup part. So I hope you'll give it a go. I feel I should discuss how the aged tea differs from the taste of not aged tea, but I would say tea in general is such a large category that could encompass so many things that I'm not sure it would really be that helpful for me to talk about that. Even the pu'er style aged teas, there's a couple different types of aging process and many, many different flavor profiles among that group, so I really don't feel like that's that useful in the sense that, yeah, I could describe many specific flavors, but there are so many. I think it's better to just try a tasting set and you get a variety. On that note, we come to the kombucha section. And I'm aware that kombucha, and kind of in the latter half of this video, the kombucha section is going to be one where probably the least people have in their mind what flavor like that is. Like, what are we even referring to? What is that drink? And so, quite opposite to how I feel about the tea, we probably need to start this section by me just drinking some kombucha, and I will attempt to describe the flavor. Now, in this section, we're going to describe, I'm going to tell you how I make kombucha, although I'm going to recommend buying a kit. So you get a starting culture, a SCOBY, so you can make kombucha. But basically what you're making is a sweet tea that is fermented using a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, a SCOBY. You'll see what that looks like, don't you worry. Might be a little touch gross to some people, but I get a little wigged out by that stuff, and I have come to tolerate comfortably my SCOBY. In fact, this whole kombucha section actually wasn't my idea. My mom watches my videos and just has 9,000 IQ and got me a kombucha kit. And I thought, wait, yeah, this is so good. Kombucha is another of the categories where this is kind of expensive in my part of the world. So you get basically infinite of it for like more or less free. You don't need that much tea and sugar to make quite a bit. But again, what is it? That's how you make it. That's, what it is. But what is the taste? It has a note of white vinegar, but very faintly. Of course, it kind of is vinegar. Very faintly, there's a vinegary taste. Chemically, I don't have the knowledge to know exactly what that is. So it does have a bit of a, how do you describe this? Like apple cider vinegar, if you cut it with apple juice, maybe, is sort of close. It has a little bit of that vinegary flavor, but don't think vinegar drink. It's mild, very soft on the palate. I don't really know how to describe. There's not a strong attack. Whatever flavor there is slow, very relaxed. Does it taste like tea? I don't really think so. This is kombucha that I made, but it doesn't have anything flavoring it. I just used tea and sugar, only one tea and plain white sugar. And after the first fermentation, I didn't add anything to it. So it's like the most plain kombucha. I used a pretty specific tea, but it's hard. I think, though, that thinking of apple cider, some parts of the world you might be confused whether I mean alcoholic or not. Cloudy apple juice, let's say it that way, pressed apple juice. That is close to the flavor. It has a spicy note, I don't know if that's our brains just thinking of cinnamon when we have apple juice, because apples and cinnamon, or those baking spice flavors, are so often paired. I don't know if that's what that is, but it does have that. Like, this has a kind of peach pie sort of flavor, and that peachiness is from this tea, I believe. But the pie spice thing, it's kind of like that. A baking spicy, slightly acidic like vinegar, very refreshing drink. Very refreshing is, I guess, the best way I can describe it. It's hard. Now, again, this is one, and I will actually show you later, a comparison between my kombucha and store-bought kombucha. This is another one where, kind of like with coffee, you could buy Cometeer and then see if you like that. Buy a bottle of store-bought kombucha. While buying a lot of it would be expensive, buying one bottle to see if you would like this first is definitely a good option. And I'll recommend a brand, a type, if you want that. But now we need to show how you would make it. Of course, keeping in mind that I have a kit, and so this is how my kit recommends making it, but the basic procedure is simple and is going to be the same, no matter what method you're using. Here is the jar that has my kombucha in it. You can see it's sealed with a breathable top. In this case, I actually used the tea cake wrapper from the tea cake that I used, that this tea came in. This is a wild aged tea. It's 6 or 7 years old since I bought it. It was 3 or 4 years old when I bought it, and I waited a few years. And I had a little bit of it left, and I thought I'd try it. It was pretty expensive. This was a crazy tea to drink plain. And I decided to use just that. I put that tea in with some sugar. I'll show you that process later. And then this sat here for 2 to 3 weeks. 2 weeks. This one was a little shorter, 2 weeks. And now I'm going to show you extracting it, taking the kombucha out and then resetting to make more, just to clarify what we're doing here. So a breathable top, a piece of cloth more or less, with a rubber band around the top. That's all that is. I named it. I had a date. I did 25 grams of wild raw pu'er. And on the top, you can see the SCOBY. That's that symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that is fermenting it. Eating the caffeine, by the way, it does decaffeinate it naturally. Eating the sugar and, extracting delicious flavors from the tea, pooping out delicious flavors from the tea. I will take the SCOBY out with my cleaned, right now I'm washing my hands, with my cleaned hands. I'm just gonna pick it up and take it out. I get quite sensitive about textures, so honestly, this feels a touch gross to me, but it's not that weird. The SCOBY is quite solid. It looks a bit gross underneath, but it is pretty solid. I'm gonna put it in a bowl. I'm gonna pour a little bit of the kombucha into that bowl as a starting culture or batch for the next round of kombucha, just to get it going with that new food that I'm gonna feed it. So a little bit of the kombucha that's left, not that much, and that's just gonna go aside for now. Pretty simple so far. Now I'll simply put this in storage vessels, so I'll bottle it. You could ferment it. When I said first fermentation earlier, I was referring to the fact that you could carbonate this. It's quite common. The commercial stuff you'll buy is generally carbonated. Kind of like in the concept of a fairness pitcher, I'm stirring it just in case the stronger stuff is at the bottom or whatever, which it tends to be like with vinegar. I don't know if that does anything, by the way, but that's why I'm stirring it. And then I'm just going to pour it into bottles. I could drink some right now. What I just drank earlier, that was just this bottled in that jar right there. I just went down to the fridge, poured some of that, and drank it. So it wasn't carbonated or anything. Although you can see it is a little fizzy. It might just be the yeast and stuff moving around, the probiotics, the probies. But some of them I'll put in bottles that have flip tops, so they will build decent amounts of pressure. And I'll give them a little food. I'll put a little bit of sugar or whatever. You could put fruit in too. And I'll just leave these for 2 to 4 days at room temperature. We'll open one of these and see how it carbonated a little bit later, by the way. And yeah, again, they have a decently strong top that will actually build pressure. Those jar tops for these jars I've been showing you throughout the video won't hold enough of a seal. They probably won't explode. They'll just pop and they won't hold much pressure. But that's fine. I don't want all of it carbonated. I'm not sure I like carbonation. I'm not sure if I prefer them carbonated. So it's a choice you can make. And I will show you a little later doing one that has ginger in it. You could put flavors in them. Just put whatever you have. Throw some spices in, throw some syrup in. You're adding sugar, just put a syrup you have in. Juice works great. Putting a little bit of apple cider is delicious in these. Really, it tastes like apple. It already tastes like apple cider, but it adds some interesting complexity. You don't need too much sugar. That was maybe 2 teaspoons. I don't know, 10, 15 grams of sugar. I don't know. Don't worry about it that much. It doesn't need to be too precise. I'm going to wash it in with a little more kombucha. And that's it. Pretty simple for just basically bottling the rest. I'm going to quickly show you adding some ginger to one, and then we'll talk about how you reload that bottle once I pour all the kombucha I made out of the jar. So I just sliced some ginger and put it in there. And then I'll just top it up with kombucha. Ginger is noteworthy here because ginger skin has a naturally occurring yeast on it. Pineapple also has naturally occurring yeast on the skin. If you want to try kombucha, or something like kombucha, a natural ferment like this, kind of simple ferment that doesn't require a whole lot of precision, but you don't want to buy the kit, I would get organic ginger or pineapple, simply because the skin would have, pesticides on it otherwise, that normally might not be the end of the world. You could wash them, but in this case, you want the skin because that's where that culture is. So maybe go for organic in this case. And yeah, slice up your ginger or pineapple with the skin, put it in a jar with a bit of sugar. Just do this, but with a ginger or pineapple, basically. You could put sweet tea in too. That could be interesting. And those don't take very long. They can take, 3 to 5 days. If you look up tepache, that's the pineapple one, or like a ginger bug, that's what people call the ginger one. You can look that up on the internet and find your own guide. I didn't feel the need to show that here. It's more straightforward, if anything. There'll be no culture on the top or whatever. If anything, maybe if you're wigged out by this, that's a less wiggy version of it. That's delicious. That's great. If you want to try that, that's a great way to do that. That general flavor profile, I think, is close to the flavor profile of kombucha. But again, you could just purchase some kombucha. Okay, so with that, we've poured off all the kombucha that was generated. Here's the jar again, filled about halfway. It's 8 cups of clean filtered water. And to that, I'm going to add, you remember that tea from before? This is all the tea that I made in that big batch of rapid brewing tea from before when I talked about making more tea with higher quality tea. I saved that. I added a lot of sugar to it. I used my kit's instructions. But there's about a cup total of sugar, to give you an idea, to make a pretty sweet tea. And I'm now just dumping that into the water, just dumping all that in there. And then I'm going to add the starting culture and the SCOBY back in. And that's it. And it's reset. I'll give it a label. I'm sure that's in here somewhere. I don't think we need to see too much detail for this part, but I'll stir it around. I'll dump back in the culture really quick with that starter fluid. I'll try to get it, situated and everything. Name it YOLO Double Kombu and give it a date and say how much of whatever I put in it. And there you go. Simple as that. I'll tie off the top, and I'm just going to leave this in place in the dark with some good airflow for 2 weeks. That's it. So you can see, really very simple. You don't need practically any tea and sugar, and you could just keep going. I have not had a SCOBY kind of die or reach the end of its lifespan yet, but I'm told that that's quite easy to see when it happens. So I wish I could advise you better about that, but I can't. It's probably pretty straightforward. I will say that when I got my kit, my experience was I put my SCOBY that came with the kit in, and it had some starter fluid. It was just in a bag in the kit. And what happened for me was that a new SCOBY formed on the top, and I got rid of the old one, and I have a new one on top. Mine, if you looked closely, looks quite layered, so I wonder if I will eventually have yet another new one. I'll keep using that. That was my understanding, but I don't know. There's really good resources on the internet about this kind of stuff, so no fear, you've got some backup. I've been looking forward to this part very much. In this section, I'm just going to compare some commercial kombucha that I bought at the supermarket and my kombucha. I specifically got this one carbonated, or I tried to. Here it is. Let's see if it's carbonated, I guess. And then I'm going to compare that to a brand from the store that I like. And that brand is GT's Synergy, this one. There's a lot of reasoning behind why this brand might be really tasty to me, but yeah, it's the one I like. I've tried quite a few, and I like this one a lot more. I think it's noticeably better. Their secret ingredient is kiwi juice. They all have kiwi juice, and they say on the bottle that they're using a blend of black tea and green tea in most, if not all of them, which I think is pretty interesting. I would imagine the process is similar to how I'm making mine, though note that kombucha may have some minor amount of alcohol in it. And for store-bought kombucha, they need to be more careful about that, because if it goes above a certain level, we could get into a whole history of kombucha going over the alcohol limit, and we're not going to do that here. Anyway, let's compare them. So I'm just giving them a bottoms-up turn, because the good stuff settles on the bottom, the cultures, I guess, the probiotics. And then, yeah, this one I hope doesn't explode in my office. Maybe I shouldn't have done this in here, but didn't explode. Doesn't seem carbonated, but anyway, let's take a look. Yeah, not really carbonated. It did only have about a day and a half because I have been filming this stuff all week. It's excellent. Sweetening it and leaving it for a day or two did deepen its flavor. It doesn't just taste like more sugary. It definitely has a complexity that it didn't before. So that's interesting. I would put a little sugar in them. The yeast will probably eat most of the sugar in the first fermentation, so I doubt there's much sugar. I have no real idea, of course. Though you could take that cup of sugar that was in the big jar and math divided, but I don't really care about that, to be honest, so I didn't take the time to. It's great. Again, this tea has produced this sort of peach pie-esque flavor with a really bright, distinct acidity that at worst people might think vinegar and kind of lock onto that. But it's quenching. It reminds me a little bit of apple cider. I think it's great. This kombucha is gingerberry flavor, and again, it's got their kiwi juice and black and green tea blend, whereas mine was with pu'er and aged tea. You can see in this glass, not very sparkling, but a little bit of fizz. It is carbonated. Yeah, actually fairly carbonated out of the bottle. I haven't ever yet compared my kombucha to this. I've made 4 batches of kombucha, for full disclosure. Whoa. Wow. Really quite different. Um, this is more vinegary. That's a big thing. It's less sweet. It may not actually be less sweet, but it tastes less sweet. Indeed, for this specific brand of kombucha, I will mention that the different flavors have different amounts of sugar. GT Synergy has between 12 and 18 or 20 grams of sugar per bottle, depending on the flavor. This is one of the flavors with 12 grams of sugar, which I generally prefer. I don't think that those flavors really taste less sweet. They're just with flavors that I think benefit from less sugar, I guess. Yeah, I really like this one. There's quite a few good flavors that are only 12 grams of sugar. It's nice to keep your sugar content down. That's not bad. No bad thing. This is more refreshing tasting. I would describe it as tasting more like a seltzer than my kombucha, although it's not very seltzery. Like it tastes like it has flavors in it. It doesn't taste like just seltzer, but it's pretty carbonated. It has that carbonic acid flavor a little bit. Seltzer has a flavor even if it's not bubbly. And yeah, it's more quenching, but definitely less like a flavored drink, which is weird because it is literally a flavored drink, whereas mine is, well, it's flavored with tea. My tea, it might be down to the fact that my tea has a very complex, weird flavor, whereas this tea maybe doesn't, and it's focused on having other flavors. But note that you could use pretty cheap tea, and if you extract it in a way that probably isn't very time efficient for this company, yeah, you can get a ton of it. So anyway, a really interesting comparison, not what I expected. I remembered these, which I didn't have for the past 3 months while I was making a bunch of kombucha. I remembered these as being more sweet. They're not. That's really is strange. You don't need to sit here while I drink kombucha. Well, that being said, actually, one thing I do want to talk about in this section is using kombucha as an ingredient for other drinks. Yes, while it's delicious by itself, I also think that one of the merits of kombucha, compared to the rest of the things in this video, this takes a lot more work. In the tea section, I said buy $10 of tea and brew it in whatever and have a good time, In the syrup section, I said put sugar on your fruit and make a delicious syrup. It's not exactly rocket science. Here, I'm telling you to home ferment for 3 weeks and then bottle it and do a second fermentation, and it's a bit more of a recommendation, right? The gains are the gains are more substantial. You do get a lot of delicious kombucha. I also think it's more versatile. I think the thing you get out can make a lot of things. You really should check if you like the flavor first. But yeah, I wanna talk about that. So, for example, oh, that time it sounded like something. I'm gonna put equal parts kombucha, my kombucha, and pressed coconut. Pressed coconut. I like this brand. It's called Vita Coco. Vita Coco. Now, this is not coconut water. Coconut water is thinner. Here's the same brand with their coconut water. And some people describe the texture as a little filmy or mucusy at the worst, gross. I don't mind coconut water. I don't love it. I really, really do like pressed coconut. So if you've had a bad experience with coconut water, give it another chance. Like try pressed coconut. I'll show you what that looks like. And this makes something where the kombucha, in this case, tastes a lot like a pineapple juice. It has a tropical flavor, I guess. Very hydrating. Really cools down that vinegary suggestion from the acid. A vinegary suggestion, an autobiography by Zany Pants. It really cools down the vinegary note of the kombucha, and instead locks it onto just being a refreshing tropical, again, it's like pineapple-y somehow, which is fascinating to me. You can definitely amp it up with a syrup that you made. I'm going to use the allspice syrup again. doot a little bit of that in. And to bring us to one of the final segments in the video, I also want to talk about putting booze in it. Steven, my friend from real life, Steven, you're not supposed to watch this part. Go skip skip to the next timestamp. You figured out. Are you gone? Okay, it's fine. This is a gift for my friend Steven, but we're gonna have a little bit of it now. This is an infused whiskey that has cinnamon and a little bit of chili pepper and a little bit of honey. And I'm gonna pour just a little bit in here. Beautiful color. Give it a swirl. And I'm gonna say, please drink responsibly, and we'll have a taste. This is a prelude to the cocktail part of the video, because I struggled for a while with this video feeling overly focused on drinks. Last year, my April Fool's video offering was a drinkable status tier list for Warframe. I rated all of Warframe's damage types and status effects and made them into a matrix of cocktails, basically, and tried them all. And most of them were bad because that's not how that works. So on the one hand, I wanted to recommend good drinks because I think it's very easy to make great cocktails or alcoholic beverages if you are able to drink those and wish to drink those at home, but not like that. I wouldn't make them that way. There's a much easier methodology. And we'll talk about that in that section. But I want to note that almost all the stuff we've talked about so far is really, really helpful for cocktails. Alcohol, ethanol, is really good at holding on to flavor compounds, so you can add a ton of flavor with that tiny splash. You saw how little of that whiskey I put in, and this has opened it up so much. Where before, the coconut, the pressed coconut, and the kombucha had a little bit of an openness to them. It wasn't very flavor dense, a little bit of sweetness added, and then it's mostly the cinnamon. That body, and I don't know how to describe the whiskey flavor in here. It's an Irish whiskey. It's blended, so not incredibly distinct, sure. But it has incredible body. Like there's such a baking spicy note. It tastes like punch, I guess, but with cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg and spices that are not in there. But it really evokes those flavors. This is great. It's so good for so little effort. And the reason is that I have these modular ingredients. I've built up this library of modular ingredients. I'm going to take a brief detour to talk about hot chocolate, where you're going to see some of the benefit of those modular ingredients and devices that we've talked about during this video. But I wanted to take a detour here to say, look how far you've come. You've really got those things. I could take my hands off now, but I do have a bit more to say. Hot chocolate. What might seem like an odd addition to the video. I don't think it is. I think hot chocolate is interesting because it is a drink for which there is a good moderate recommendation. At least I think so. Hot chocolate is something where you can go crazy. It's not that crazy. You could make a chocolate sauce. You could heat it over the stove. You could double boiler melt some chocolate. You could go that way. You could buy a mix. I think both of those are pretty interesting. I spent a lot of time making hot chocolate mix and then making, manual, I guess, chocolate sauce, hot chocolate. And I was frustrated by both. I felt like the hot chocolate mix, I guess, is convenient. But I felt it was difficult to get the richness that I want in hot chocolate. I don't drink hot chocolate that much. I want a decadent drinking chocolate experience, But I don't really want to melt chocolate. This is a real case where at least I personally just won't make it. If it's, hot chocolate mix, or I have to make it by melting chocolate. I'm just not going to. Call me lazy, whatever. If I was only lazy, then I would use the mix, but I want good hot chocolate. I don't want to melt. And in pursuit of, the hot chocolate mix is closer to what I want. I'm trying to cut down effort. I found that you can add fat to your cocoa powder. They sell cocoa powder that has more fat in it. What's different about the melted chocolate hot chocolate? Well, it has more fat, more cocoa butter, more cocoa fat. And you can get cocoa powder that just has more fat in it. So in this one, I'm actually going to show you more of the process by which I have been fiddling with making hot chocolate because it's still a work in progress. There you'll see me pouring milk the way I did for the latte, less than halfway up by a little bit, then I'm going to microwave it to make it hot. And I have 2 glasses here because I'm going to try something. But here's that cocoa powder. I found it by looking for Bensdorp cocoa powder. You might also find it useful to know the percent of cocoa fat or cocoa mass. This is like 22, 24%. This is also Dutch cocoa, Dutch processed cocoa, which cuts some of the bitterness. A lot of people sort of prefer it. It can taste a little Oreo-y, but I don't think that's bad. I'm using, I don't know, 2 tablespoons maybe, and there it is. And I'm just gonna add hot milk to that. We can add syrup to that, and it'll be delicious. And again, the benefit here is that by using this high-fat cocoa powder, which might be a bit more expensive, by the way, but you can buy a lot of it, buy a bulk bag like that. That's not that expensive. You can kind of get the richness of having, a chocolate bar melted in your hot chocolate without needing to go through the trouble of melting a chocolate bar in your hot chocolate. Now, what troubles me is getting the cocoa powder dispersed without it clumping. What I'm going to do here is inspired by the fact that people recommend putting a little bit of milk in and then stirring it to get all the lumps out, and then you pour in the rest of the milk. So I thought, do I want foamed milk with my hot chocolate? Maybe I'll pour in half of the milk, leave the foam in the mug, and then pour that on top. I'm going to pour in half of the milk anyway. Why not also have it be foamy? I thought to myself. But I've personally found, this is the messiest foaming of all time, but too bad. While I'm talking, that's all right. I've personally found that it doesn't mix very well. This fattier cocoa powder, and I bet that's why, I have a lot of trouble getting it to evenly disperse. So what you're going to see when I pour it in is that even though I pour only a little bit of milk, I have this clear glass because I wanted to show you that even if I use the Subminimal Nanofoamer, there's still a lot of cocoa powder on the bottom that isn't mixed in, and on the sides it clumped. If I use a spoon to kind of disperse that, that's one thing, but it really got stuck. And this is all making a bit of a mess, you can see. Put a little raspberry syrup, pour the foam on top, and it was okay, but you can actually see as I pull it up to my head to drink that there's a little bit of, well, too bad. You can see that there's a lot of cocoa powder sort of stuck to the side. I wasn't really able to get that off, and it made a bit of a mess. And part of the reason I'm sharing this with you is that now that I've recommended a bunch of things I think are good, and I do think that that high-fat cocoa powder is a great recommendation, but they can involve some troubleshooting. The real value of a method like this isn't the recipe, because many recipes I've tried for many drinks and foods ignore the inconveniences inherent in that recipe. It can make the recipe look easy, but then actually doing it ends up being inconvenient, And so the weird consequence of, again, I think it's hard to mix that cocoa powder in because of the high fat content. Having a solution for that is what would make it a good recommendation. I'm not entirely sure that there is a really easy way to do that. Here is one other thing that I tried with some amount of frustration to get it to work. I thought, what about doing it like miso soup? If you've made miso soup before, getting your miso paste to not clump it felt similar to me problem. And so a good thing to do, one good way to do it, is to take a tea strainer or a small strainer, you put the miso paste in that, and then you kind of crush it around with a spoon. You kind of whisk it in. And the idea is that because of the tea strainer, no big clumps can make it in. Another way to think of this is when people say to sift ingredients when you're baking, the purpose of that is generally to remove clumps and so, or to like mix it or whatever. And so the idea might be similar here. It didn't really look like just sifting it would do much. That's what I was showing there. But now I will try to, grind the cocoa powder in. It doesn't fit in this mug though. That's too narrow. I guess I could get a different strainer. So I'm pouring my hot milk into a wide bowl, and then I'm going to start trying to kind of whisk it in. Again, grind it into the milk so that it doesn't clump, I guess. And this, it worked okay. It worked all right. You can see that I've still got some clumps. It's taking forever. This clip is 3 minutes long or so. So, getting my face into the shot, showing some of my frustration there as I imposingly approach from above. I don't think this is a great way to do it. I don't. I don't have an amazing recommendation for hot chocolate at the end of this. I guess I've kind of misled you. I go into a rage and blend it all up, and that didn't really work better either. This hot chocolate also settled. It will look like I get it right and it mixes pretty thoroughly. I'm making a huge mess, but you can see it looks like I got it all in. After I let this bowl sit for a while, it did settle. There was a lot of silty cocoa powder on the bottom. I'm not sure what you do about that. I guess a few other notes would be, after me going crazy with this, okay, we don't need more of that. A few notes about this would be that in commercial hot chocolate mixes, you often see powdered sugar because it's very fine. It will dissolve really quickly. You, hopefully, already have syrups from other parts of this video, so I don't think you need that. This is a great place to use syrups to add the sweetness instead. So again, I feel like this is a place where making it a bit more modular, the hot chocolate mix is not all together, but you have the components for it readily available. It will take no more time. You could just combine them as you want. That's just more fun, I think. But if you do make your own hot chocolate mix, if you're interested in that, note that commercial powdered sugar is going to have a caking agent in it, like a lot of cornstarch or something, which I didn't like in my hot chocolate. I felt like I could really taste that starchiness, or it clumped as well, I felt. That was an annoying bit. But you can do that. You can add milk powder. You can toast the milk powder to boost flavor. That's a common recommendation for making hot chocolate mix. I did that, and I didn't like it. I didn't really like it. And I think part of the reason is that getting that full fat milk, maybe my milk powder wasn't, full fat milk powder, helps boost the richness, the chocolatey richness with that high fat cocoa powder. The question simply remains, how do you mix it in effectively? And I actually don't have an answer for you in this section. It's not that bad the way I showed in this video, but it's not perfect. And I wanted to include that because including absolutely perfect methods every single time robs you of the learning experience that is meant to be the point of these videos. So that's it for the hot chocolate section. But it's really good. Seriously, get the high fat cocoa powder. It's good. So you're approaching me. We're going to speed run this cocktail section because I mostly think that people have overcomplicated cocktail recommendations. I tried in this video to make each section's recommendations tailored to the way I think those things have been not misrecommended, but maybe the way those recommendations have skewed. I want to respond to that. So in this case, I really want to quickly go through basically 3 bullet points. They are equipment, juice cubes, and cocktail specs or cocktail ratios. So equipment first, very simply, I just want to talk about jiggers and shakers. Jiggers. I love this jigger. I don't know what it is, sorry, but you can see it's got 2 ounces and then 1 ounce. This is good for a few reasons. The first one is I don't really feel there's much utility to a jigger having a tapered bit in the middle. I find this easier to hold. It's chunky, it's stable, it lies like flat. You can, hold it and do fancy tricks with a jigger that has that hourglass shape, but I don't like them. I never liked that. If you never liked them, or if you don't have a reason you want that type of jigger, I think this is better. Thing number 2, the markings are going to be a little more accurate because it's more narrow. The meniscus effect, or just meniscus thing, I don't know, a meniscus, that sort of bell or like eye contact lens shape that forms with liquids, that phenomenon, a meniscus. That means that if a vessel is wider, volumetric measurements will be less precise. Now, generally, we've measured in grams in this video because those weight-based measurements are more versatile, kind of in cooking, where things, it's not just a liquid that will fill, you get it. For cocktails, it's perfectly usable to use volume. It's very convenient to have a jigger like this, but they'll be more accurate if they're more narrow, which this is. I think that's excellent. I also just think it's it looks neat. It looks tidy. It doesn't look excessive, which I think a lot of them do. It has 1/4 ounce increments on the inside, which I think is basically all you need. Sometimes drinks call for 1/3 of an ounce, and I think you can eyeball that. And the 2 ounce side has 1/2 ounce increments, so 1/2 ounce, 1 ounce, 1.5, 2. You'll see me in this video filling this side full, and that might seem like a lot, but remember this is only 1 ounce. That's like 2/3 of a shot in a lot of places. Also, do note something I've experienced as an American is that abroad I would often see a shot be 1.5 ounces, where it's often 2 ounces in the place where I grew up in America. Not sure what to say about that, but I've noticed that that's true. My ratios, the drinks I'm going to recommend they'll be ratios. They'll be specs that are not based on like an ounce or 2 ounces or whatever. They're just, this amount relative to this amount of ingredient. And I think that that's useful. And then you can easily break it up with, half ounce or quarter ounce measurements. And then a shaker. Not a lot to recommend here. I've shown shaking in a jar throughout this video. The only thing I really want to say is that one, this is metal. It's thin metal, which means that it is thermally, you can really feel what temperature the ingredients inside are. And it doesn't have very high thermal mass. You can chill a drink down without needing to melt a ton of ice to lose, the ice loses a bunch of cold into the shaker to chill a drink down. All things being equal, it's not necessarily better to have less dilution, except in the sense that you get more control. The thing I want to highlight is that by using the same shaker setup every time, you get consistency. Kind of like measuring, the grams or the temperature the first time, and then you kind of know that. Using the same shaking thing means it's consistent. If you use a glass every time, and you learn to balance your drinks for you around that, and you don't recommend them to people that use a shaker, then I guess it doesn't matter. But I do think there's something good about using a shaker. I avoided using one because I wanted to emphasize that obviously for the shaking part, you don't need a shaker. But I almost always do actually use a shaker. I specifically didn't do that for this video, like how I used a bad kettle on purpose during this video, even though I don't normally use that kettle. The second benefit is just strainers fitting it well. These are really helpful. You can control the amount of stuff that gets in the drink, puffy foam or ice chips or whatever, by gating it different amounts. It's easy to clean because you can take the spring off. I didn't know that for the longest time. You could just take this off. It just pulls off. I think shakers are great. I think you should get a shaker. They're really helpful for lots of drinks. We've shaken several things in this video that were not cocktails. So I do recommend getting a shaker. I think this and a bar spoon are some of the easier recommendations in this video. I specifically put the cocktail section at the end here to emphasize that I don't specifically recommend them for alcohol. Like they're just useful. I would just get those things anyway. Oh yeah, one final note I forgot. This might seem like a thermal hazard. You pour hot liquid in this and then it's going to hurt your hands, right? I've found that because it has decent thermal mass, this actually does have a decent thermal mass, you don't hurt your hand. I use this with hot liquid pretty frequently, and provided you don't hold it up here, it's perfectly fine. Maybe doesn't matter at all, but a quick note. Boy howdy, it's time for lime juice cubes. We're going to speed through a lot of these. I'm going to be using juice cubes in a lot of these videos. I don't like to need to have fresh citrus. You're so close to being able to make good cocktails whenever you want. You got your syrup, you got your spirits, you got your mix-ins or whatever, liqueurs and stuff. But the fruit, you want good juice. And I do think it makes a big difference to use fresh juice. Having a juicer like this is really helpful when you want to juice a lot of limes and make juice cubes the way I'm going to recommend. So it might seem like getting a device that only does one thing, but when you're juicing like 5 limes in a row, I really like this. I think it gets more juice out of them pretty easily, as you can see, and it makes them really easy to, the next step. You'll see my foot photobombing in this section. We weren't sure what the setup would be yet. But here I have these empty limes that I juiced already, and I'm cutting their peels so that they don't hold too much fluid inside, so they're not little cups, right? I'm just cutting up those peels, and then kind of like what we did with the syrup in the syrup section, I'm going to weigh those peels. And then I'm going to use a calculator, which I've linked in the description, to figure out what acids I need to add to those peels to perform a process that has been referred to as making super juice before. The idea here is that, like with the raspberry syrup, we're going to extract the oils, just the oils in this case, not the raspberry flavor in the raspberry case, with acid, with powdered acid. You could do this with sugar, but we're going to do it with acid. Acid that is the acid profile of lime juice. Doing this, combining it with the lime juice that we got out of the limes, will create a kind of more limey than lime juice, and it produces a ton ton of lime juice. I will show you. This part took forever because it made so much lime juice. After about a day, this is a little quicker than the sugar syrup with fruit, there'll be a bunch of liquid in the jar. And what's happened is that those powdered acids have drawn the essential oil out of the lime peel. I've seen people peel the limes instead of putting the whole rind in. I don't think that makes enough of a difference for how much time it adds to the process. So I don't do that. Once there's a good amount out, you don't have to dissolve all that acid because you're going to add a ton of water. The calculator tells you how much water to add. What I do is I add a little bit of water and then shake it to dissolve the rest of the acid, get everything off of those lime peels. And then that's going to get combined with the lime juice you have. You're going to have to save it in the fridge for a day. And you'll have a gigantic batch of, it looks a little thinner than normal lime juice, but you will taste it, and it tastes like more limey than lime, the limiest. It does keep for a long time. One benefit of the super juicing is that acid balanced lime oil stuff that you made to add to the lime juice, well, it doesn't have the enzymes in lime juice that make it spoil. So it does last longer. You've improved the shelf life, but this makes so much. I only used 3 little limes to make all this juice. And now I'm going to put it in these ice cube trays. I filled these 2 ice cube trays up like 4 times. Both of them up 4 times. So you see what I'm doing here is I'm measuring into one of them a known amount of lime juice. So that was 0.5 ounces, half an ounce of lime juice. And then I'm just eyeballing about the same amount into each little thing. I don't really care if it's that precise personally. You could measure every time, that'd be fine. But the idea here is that now when I use these in drinks, I know that's half an ounce of lime juice. I might occasionally want 3/4 of an ounce, and it'd be easy enough to split a cube in half. But I think half an ounce is a good size. Then I can use these when I make drinks, and we're not going to watch me pour all this lime juice, but there it is. And then you seal them and put them away. And I'm going to show you popping them out. For which I'm going to recommend these silicone ice cube trays. So they have lids. That's really nice. You can stack them and save space in the freezer. When they're frozen, what I'm going to do is take off the lid, get a freezer bag, like a zip freezer bag, put the ice cube tray in the freezer bag, and then these ice cube trays have silicone parts on the bottom, so you can very quickly pop out all of the ice cubes right into the bag. Super easy, really quick, which is good because only 3 limes, I made like 8 ice cube trays full of juice cubes. So again, you'll see very, very quick pop, and there you go. That bag is going to be really full by the time I freeze all that lime juice. So you're locked and loaded. It's time to make some drinks with them. And the first of the 2 basic ratios I'm going to recommend is 2 to 1 to 1. I'm going to use some lemon juice cubes that I made previously, same way, and some gin, and also the allspice syrup from earlier in the video. One thing I love about gin is you often get to see what herbs and spices are in it. So if there's any you don't like some people don't like coriander or think it tastes like soap. A lot of people just think gin tastes like soap. It often has coriander in it. And sometimes you can just check and see, does it have coriander? I'm going to use that jigger as I showed you before. And the ratio I said was 2 to 1 to 1, 2 parts spirit, 1 part sweet, 1 part sour. So I'm 4 total ounces, if you want to think of it that way. 2 of them are going to be the spirit, and then 1 of them will be the syrup, and 1 of them will be 2 juice cubes in this case. I'm not going to do that exact ratio. I'm just using the rest of this gin, however much that is. But you get the idea. Very simple. And that will work with pretty much any 40% alcohol, 80 proof spirit. Just pick a juice, a citrus, and a syrup that complements their flavor. Here, I didn't like the allspice syrup. This actually ended up being kind of, I don't know. I wish I'd used the raspberry syrup here, but I thought it would be tasty. Gin, I think you can go lemon or lime. Broadly, I kind of feel like most spirits, you can go either way, but tequila, rum, I think lime is significantly better. Your mileage may vary, try it. But it's pretty simple, something I don't like in cocktail videos is they often take a long time talking about all these drinks they're the same drink. Like a margarita, a daiquiri, a gin sour, a whiskey sour, they are the same drink. Those are the same drink. Yes, you might want a little more acid or sweetness or alcohol or whatever. Sure, of course. But the concept of that drink is not different from those other drinks. It does not bear recommending separately than, those other drinks. That really frustrates me. And so I wanted to emphasize in this shorter section that, you could just use that ratio and put out good drinks. A note about tequila, actually. If you were to make a margarita, some margarita recipes suggest doing 2 parts or so of tequila, 1 part or so of lime juice. So far, it's the same as this. But then instead of a syrup, they recommend 1 part or so of Cointreau, or some kind of orange liqueur. Liqueurs often have about the same sweetness or sugar level as these syrups. So where that might confuse you, I think it's worth keeping in mind. It's kind of the same thing. Here you can say, I'm shaking the hell out of those juice cubes to break them up. One minor inconvenience of them is that you do have to make sure they get crushed. You can just briefly smack them with your jigger or your bar spoon just to help it along, and I don't find it takes that long. This is also a place where the higher thermal mass of that jar, you remember when I was talking about the shaker not taking much cold from your ice? The jar does melt it faster in the sense that it takes more energy to make the jar cold, if that makes sense. Then you can just pour it into a glass, but note that drinks are generally balanced with their recipes including water from dilution. So if you don't put in some ice and shake it with it, or you could just put some water in, you will not have a drink that will taste balanced the way you might think. This is a frustration of a lot of cocktail recipes. Again, another reason I wanted to keep this short, because a big thing to remember is that those recipes include water. They just don't list it as an ingredient. They say shake with ice. And in that process, you're adding, in my experience, about an ounce of water. What I would recommend doing actually is just pouring water in to taste. Just make your drink and pour in some water to taste. In a minute, we're going to talk about kind of condiments for drinks, and the biggest one is literally just water. A lot of coffee I've had, some tea, and especially coffee and cocktails, literally just some water with it. I mean, you should drink water anyway. But pouring a little water in has saved or lifted up many drinks I've enjoyed. Don't feel like you're wussing out or something by not drinking it at a higher concentration. It's there for you to enjoy. You don't need to drink coffee. You don't need to drink a gin sour. Put some water in it. You might like that a lot better. I reckon a lot of people would like that better because you know what happens if you dilute that drink I just showed you with a good amount of water? That's lemonade with gin in it. Cocktail section ending pretty quickly with probably my favorite recommendation in the whole video. There's a Barbados rhyme for making punch. And it goes like this: 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak. And that's the ratio I want to show you for the final drink in the video. 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak, which I'm going to mess up when I make the drink here. What are those components? Well, sour, the juice cubes, sweet, the syrup, simple. And then strong is the liquor. I'm going to use rum here. Weak is the one that's a bit open to interpretation. So we'll get there. But for now, you can see I'm messing up the ratio. I am doing 1 of sweet and then 2 of sour, which I generally wouldn't recommend. The weak component often contains a bit of acid in many, well, the ones I'm going to recommend, but a lot of weak components have some acid in them. So you will end up getting a bit more of an acid balance. You know that 2-to-1-to-1 drink we made before? Well, that drink had equal parts of an acidic component and a sweet component. This drink seems to have more sweet, but in fact, the weak component often contributes some acid. Again, here I've messed it up, and I'm haplessly unaware that I've done 1 of sweet and 2 of sour, which is 4 of those half-ounce juice cubes. You see how easy it is to dose that out? But yeah, I totally messed up the ratio, but it's fine. Then I'm going to add 3 of strong, and then the weak component. I'm going to use kombucha here from that kombucha section. Pineapple juice, coconut, pressed coconut, perhaps. Water, traditionally, I guess, if you want to make punch, which is what it was traditionally designed for. But no, put something with some flavor in. Wine, white wine, perfectly fine. Again, I think the guiding star here is a beverage you would drink by itself that is light in flavor, but if anything is a little acidic. That can be good. Fruit juice, like if you were to use apple juice, I would argue that's a bit too strong. Maybe cut it half with water. This requires some intuition. Because a lot of the drink is that weak component, and then you're adding stronger flavors on top of it, It's surprisingly prone to just working out anyway. That's the great thing about this ratio. Some spices, getting a syrup that is really loud is really useful in these drinks, very tasty. You could absolutely do what I said before and use a liqueur, the 2 of sweet. You could do, Cointreau or your orange liqueur or whatever, sweet liqueur. Many of those have an alcohol content on the bottle of like 25% or so. They're often a strong spirit that is sugared. They've added a lot of sugar to it. So that's something to look out for, but you're just going to have to taste them. If they taste like boozy, simple syrup, then you're good. Use that as a sweet component. So you can adapt it. You see, I don't think it would be that helpful to fill this section with a ton of examples of that ratio or these 2 ratios. Many drinks, most drinks that I think people have in the common consciousness are those 2 ratios. So I don't feel it's that useful to go on and on about them. These are also pretty chill drinks. They're a reasonable, not too much alcohol. Please drink responsibly, folks. And they have quite a bit of other stuff in them. They're fairly sweet. You should adjust it to taste. I'd recommend adjusting the sweetness the most. You're here at the end, and I want to talk a little bit about condiments. I briefly mentioned water in the alcohol section. The cocktails that I recommended, and also often coffee, can benefit a lot from a little splash of just water. And I think people not worrying so much about, am I diluting the drink? Is that polluting the drink somehow or whatever? I really think you shouldn't worry about that. I think balancing it to your taste that way is great. It's a great reason to make things a little on the strong side and then add water to them. You will find that industry professionals do that thing. Don't feel bad about doing that. It is arguably imprecise not to. In the case of cocktails where they're shaken and that's meant to add the right amount of water, but you have to use very specific ice to do that, which you probably don't. I don't have very specific ice. You can definitely go down that road, but I think it's worth considering. You could just add water. You could just put water in it. There are kind of 2 other condiments, like drink condiments, that I want to recommend. The first and probably obvious one to people who really like cocktails is saline solution, but not just for cocktails. This can brighten up pretty much any drink. If you don't know whether you should put a drop or 2 of saline solution in your cocktail, put it in. It's good. Maybe every 4 ounces, put in 2 drops. Now, it's not going to make it taste salty. This is 20% salt dissolved in 80% water, which is easy to do. You put it in something like this and just shake it a lot. It might take a little bit to dissolve, but you'll get it. I tried using, is this one? You can kind of see it. I tried using Himalayan salt, the pink salt, so that it would be pink and I would kind of know it was saline solution. I could do other types of solutions. I've been experimenting with a base solution, basically baking soda water, for some weird coffee stuff with manipulating pH. But anyway, and so I thought it would be cool if it was pink. It's a tiny bit pink. Is that just the light refract? Anyway, whatever. For coffee as well. I don't think that putting saline solution in your hot coffee will ever make it taste better than if you had brewed it better or picked a coffee that you would just prefer. But it may allow you to salvage coffee that is, let's say, bitter in a way that you do not enjoy. Saline solution will neutralize bitterness in a way that can be quite magical. So I would highly recommend giving that a try. You don't necessarily need saline solution, but it's just easy if you're going to use it for a lot of stuff. You could put a little salt in. If you make coffee and you're stuck with that coffee, but it's bitter in a way you wouldn't like, you could put in some saline solution. I'm not prepared to talk about this, but I briefly mentioned that base solution before. The idea is that if your coffee was more acidic than you'd like, you could neutralize that with that base solution. And then kind of no matter what goes wrong with your coffee, you could correct it. I don't know. I'm kind of okay with just making more coffee. Or you could use that coffee to make a cafe shakerato, put a little sugar syrup in it, shake it nice and cold. But then again, I would put saline solution in that. The second thing and the final recommendation of this entire video is putting bitters in, again, not just cocktails. This section is here because they're more obvious for cocktails, but putting a little bit of bitters on that froth that was on the 1, 2, 3, 4 drink, the 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak, in that tall glass, and it has that big head. Put in some bitters, swirl it a bit, and they kind of stay at the top. They create a gradient. Very tasty. But this is good in lots of things. Really, really good in kombucha, in my experience. Many types of bitters. That was Angostura bitters, which is the one everybody recommends. Again, Angostura bitters and all these specific recommendations that I'm not sponsored by are in the comments of this video, the description of this video. And I'm sure there'll be more in the comments. But chocolate bitters have been useful to me, some kind of chocolate bitters. And generally what these have is something that looks like this, like a little dasher top. You can see these measured in dashes, where you just sort of alley-oop the bottle. I hope this doesn't spill out. Okay, that's tight. You know, boom, boom, boom for, 3 dashes or whatever into a drink. Maybe not the most precise measurement. You could do bar spoons. That's also not a very precise measurement. Half teaspoons, that's just a wild guess about how much that is. I don't know. Like, it's fine to just measure it that way. Just drink it. It's going to be fine. But the benefit of bitters, and really kind of my pitch for the end of the cocktail section, is that much like it is in question whether tasting coffee, like getting used to the taste of black coffee, exploring that flavor, much like that is kind of in question. It's kind of hard to say if that's valuable. Alcohol. The thing to think about is that humanity has spent a lot of time making coffee, tea, alcohol taste good. I think the elephant in the room is that the reason humanity has spent a long time making those things taste good is because drugs. Like, it's because drugs. I am not strongly affected by caffeine in a way I can notice. I don't experience an energized effect when I drink caffeine. If I did, I would be bouncing off the walls by this point of the video because I've had a lot of caffeine today. I don't feel great if I have a lot of caffeine. I can still feel it, but it definitely doesn't seem to rouse me the way it does other people. And some people genetically don't seem to be affected by caffeine. That checks out. I also have a strong constitution against alcohol. I don't get drunk easily, if you want to think of it that way. Please drink responsibly. It's always more satisfying to really enjoy a few drinks rather than to pound a bunch. Make something you like, make another thing you enjoy, and that's it. And you will have a better time, I swear to you. I think that making drinks manually is a great way to do this. You know how much alcohol is in them for sure. You can tell the people you're serving them how much is in them, and you can visually see. You don't feel good preparing a drink, don't drink more. And putting water in your drink is also not a bad way to keep it down. Please drink responsibly. Please use the things in this video to be happy and have fun and enjoy things, not to be too drunk. But my point is that alcohol has a lot of chemical benefits. Alcohol can hold onto flavor very effectively, and that's what these bitters can do. You can put very little fluid in and add a ton of flavor. I was going to talk about infused spirits earlier with that whiskey, and again, just putting cinnamon, some pepper flakes, a little honey in that spirit means a tiny splash adds a ton of flavor to something. That is a very powerful property of using ethanol. That doesn't necessarily have to involve getting intoxicated. You could just do a quick dash of this and you'll add a huge amount of flavor with a negligible amount of alcohol. Even people who can't tolerate alcohol should be perfectly fine. Talk to your doctor using something like Angostura bitters, which is in a number of cooking recipes in parts of the world. So I think it's really something to explore. I know this is at the end, but do not let that make it a light recommendation. One of the easiest things you can do to level up your drink game in this video and improve almost every single one of these drinks is buying a bottle of Angostura bitters. Go get one. I don't have one because I put it into this beautiful dasher thing because I like Angostura bitters so much, and I'm out because I used it all. That's most of what I have to say. I wanted to leave you with that idea that perhaps the reason to try these things, to explore, alcohol, coffee, tea, is because humanity has spent a lot of energy making them taste interesting. Sometimes because the alcohol is good at tasting interesting because it can hold on to flavor compounds effectively. And other times maybe just because it's full of caffeine that people really like, sure. But nevertheless, there is a lot of flavor to explore there. And I guess really the only value proposition is that you get many, many new flavors. Like, that's kind of it, right? There will be some people who don't want that. I think something to think about is that people seem to respond quite differently to a big, exaggerated new flavor. People seem to have different levels of tasting ability. Some people seem to taste more than others. I don't think it's only that people often haven't had the interesting version of a thing that people actually like. I think many people who think they don't like coffee just haven't had the coffee that the people who really like coffee like, but they believe they have had it. They just don't know how different the thing that people like is. That being said, I'm convinced that's not all that's going on. Some people just don't care about taste as much, and that's okay. Like, I think this is good because you can find out. So I hope you find out. I hope you enjoyed this. Happy April Fool's Day.